Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this podcast that I still don't think has a name, but it's on the Matt's Musings blog. I have Lachlan with me again. Hello, Lachlan.
Hey, Matt. Great to be back. I'm glad I did okay last time to get the return invite.
So today we're here to chat about the budget, which is out tomorrow. Very exciting. Now, I don't know much about Australia, so I've had to bring in Lachlan as the resident budget politics expert in Australia, former Treasury official, of course. So, what are your thoughts, Lachlan?
Yeah, I think the former Treasury official tag gets a lot of heavy lifting, but I'm happy to take it. And yeah, obviously I'm a big budget fan. The reason why I'm a big budget fan is not because of all the fun coordination of documents that goes into it, but because it is, as they say, a statement of government priorities. So it tells you a bit about where the economy's at, what the government thinks is a priority, and what they want to spend money on or focus on in terms of what they're doing. So it might be useful to go through, I suppose, like the electoral cycle and budgets and how they interact. Just for those who may not be as interested or as into it as we are.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, especially it's March.
Yeah.
And last year this happened in May. I know because it was close to the New Zealand budget, and I had the great opportunity of blogging on that then. So what's up with the March budget?
Yeah, us Australians, we're flexible, we're agile, we're responsive. So the budget in Australia is traditionally in May, has this beautiful tree in Parliament House that blooms a very bright red just around the time of the budget called the budget tree. But actually, there's no set rule on when you can have a budget. So you can move it around, effectively to any time of year, as long as you get the budget bills passed so the government doesn't stop defaulting on its payments. And so traditionally it's in May, but because we've got an election coming up in May this year, they've moved the budget forward to March. And that happened in the last election cycle in 2022. We had a March budget just before the election in May 2022. It's kind of the budget we thought we weren't going to have. The idea was they'd call an election by now, which means the budget wouldn't be delivered and would be, in full campaign mode. Because of, I suppose, events happened. And so now we're in a later election and we're having the budget we didn't think we'd have.
Nice. Now, I believe the exact election date hasn't been called, but it's been a while now that the parties have been in implicit sort of, what was it called? Electioneering mode. Now, when we look at this, what I'm trying to figure out is how much is this budget actually going to capture sort of the electioneering of Labour coming in and the risks associated with revenue coming from Trump? Versus when we come closer to election day, will there need to be some sort of update like you would normally have before an election?
That's a good question. So we have this thing in Australia called the Charter of Budget Honesty, introduced by Peter Costello back in the day. Very exciting legislation that you can go and read. And so for those who aren't aware, the budget in normal times or in general times, that's a statement of the government. So it's the treasurer and the finance minister who own that, who put it out there. They could actually put in forecasts and numbers of any kind they wanted. They could say inflation is going to be 1% and growth is going to be 7%. It's up to them to make that call. The treasury and finance department will inform them, but it's their call. But the Charter of Budget Honesty requires that I think within 10 days of the election being called, the departments of Treasury and Finance to put together kind of like a mini economic statement budget that gives both parties or everyone involved in the election an understanding of where the economy is at. And so particularly in the context of this budget coming, that kind of constrains what forecasts or assumptions you might make, because in 2 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time, the Department of Treasury and Finance are going to put their own independent numbers out there. So yeah, to your question, that kind of constrains, what they might be saying in terms of the forecast. But as you mentioned, we're already in implicit electioneering mode. So there will be things that governments plan to release or announce or do in the election campaign that will go into this budget. So that's something you can watch out for on Tuesday night.
Nice. So here's the thing, right? Is back in 1990, there was an election in New Zealand, and what had happened is the budget numbers that were put in, like before the election, were complete trash. And when the new government came in, it looked like New Zealand was in big fiscal trouble. the rating agencies immediately downgraded government debt, and New Zealand went into what was essentially its depression. It was worse than the GFC. It was worse than COVID in a number of ways. And that led to New Zealand saying, oh man, we need something like the charter you've described with the Public Finance Act. Now, that was a time of great uncertainty. You'd had the collapse of a bunch of financial firms around the world in the lead up to that, and the collapse in non-residential investment in both Australia and New Zealand. The time we're coming into now with Trump is something that I feel that people are underrating. The global financial crisis, I remember September 2008. I was a young economist at the time, and I could feel that people were underrating that. And we had a finance firm associated with us, and they were telling us, oh my God, this is world ending. And so we were like, okay, this is calm before the storm territory, and it was. When you came to COVID, I felt the opposite. People were like, this is the end of the world. It's like our economic projections are completely out of whack. People know what's going on. There's some certainty. There's going to be harm and a lot of dislocation and crazy things happening, but it's not the same economic crisis. And that turned out to be right. With Trump, we have all these tariffs all around the world, spiking uncertainty. We have a situation where countries are changing what's going on with each other. And on April 2nd, Trump is going to come out with a big announcement of tariffs. Now, how much do you think that this budget and the budget set of forecasts are going to capture that and give us really a fair reflection of the types of risks we're facing? Is this the first big economic announcement in Australia that will truly outline how monumental these shocks might be? And do you think they will capture that properly?
I think the short answer is no. So I've got many things to think about from that question. So a good but long question. The first thing that I should have said previously is, so this 10 days after the election's called, Treasury and Finance document that gets put out that's meant to constrain, I suppose, the political side of things, is economists are not infallible. They're not perfect, particularly macroeconomists, I'd say, as a microeconomist. And so if you look back to the PFO, the pre-election fiscal outlook that was put together in 2022, they were predicting CPI or inflation of 4.25% for the year and for the financial year ending 30 June 2022, which was all of a month and a half away. They missed that by, a fair bit, almost 1 percentage point. So these forecasts are not infallible, even if they are independent. So it really comes down to the kind of two-part answer to your question. Will the political side of it take this into account? It depends on what kind of case they want to make. And I suspect the current government's case they want to make to the public is, we've gone through the hard times, we've been there with you, and now the good times are ahead. We've got over the inflation hump. Wages are increasing, real wages are increasing, inflation's moderating, the private sector, based on one print of the national accounts, might be coming back. Good times are ahead, stick with us. That message is much harder to sell if you're realistic about the turbulence that is potentially coming with the Trump administration. So I think you'll see words like uncertainty and global uncertainty a lot in the Treasurer's speech, but whether that's reflected in the forecasts, I'm a little bit more skeptical. There is a sensitivity analysis component to the budget. So for the really detailed nerds like us, we can go look at that, and that'll put forward some like tests of sensitivity around forecasts. They tend to be about iron ore prices and things like that, which really dictate the fiscal side. And so you can kind of use that to impute what you think a Trump tariff war might mean for demand of iron ore from China, and then kind of flow that through the budget. But whether it's specifically focused on, I don't think so. There's something called Budget Statement 4 that sits in Budget Paper 1, which is kind of where Treasury opines on an issue of the day. So previously it's been about like the labour market or the decarbonisation journey. Ideally, Budget Statement 4 would have the focus on what does a Trump tariff war mean for Australia in the future, but I'm pretty skeptical about whether that'll be the case. Then the second part of the answer to your question is how much of this is being thought about by the public servants and the policymakers. So I think it is being thought about. It's just whether it's reflected in the forecasts. The other issue here is you obviously got great foresight, but based on previous things that happened in New Zealand. But not to re-quote from the Treasurer's speech, but there's a lot of uncertainty in what the variance of Trump's actions could be, right? And so, how do you go about forecasting that in a world where Trump's actions are really unpredictable? So, a lot of people thought this time could be similar to last time, where he'll just use tariffs as a tool to like negotiate. That clearly isn't the case. But what happens if we're in a world where it's, we're not just talking about tariffs? What happens if we're in a world where Trump says, we don't like China, China are the enemy, you're digging up iron ore and selling it to China to build ships to fight us, stop selling iron ore to China? What does that look like in our forecasts? That is, that's not an impossible potential thing that will come down the pipeline. So that's the long answer. The short answer is I don't think it'll factor in as much as it should. It's also difficult for it to factor in, but it's obviously something we should be conscious of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, and fair to call out that I made it sound like my forecasts are good when they're not always particularly good. But in this instance, it is quite difficult to tell what's going to happen due to the uncertainty. I mean, during the Great Depression, it was uncertainty about trade and tariffs and uncertainty about what people would do that drove a lot of what was happening. And so I think uncertainty in itself can be harmful. But when you look at exchange rates, when you look at asset prices outside of the US, it's not really screaming recession in the same way. So I think your fiscal authorities will probably have a fairly mild view about what's going to happen just with elevated risks. And I think that's probably the right call. I do really fear that in a month we end up in a situation where the budget position is substantially worse, though. And I think that's an element that we can tease through over the coming month as there's more revelation of information. But of course, today's discussion is on the budget. So I want to ask a bit about tax reform. I see that Jim Chalmers has made very clear that there's not only going to be no tax reform, but it sounds like there's not even going to be adjustment for the fact that there's been fiscal drag during the next term. And so essentially, increases in the tax take occurring. And that's likely to meet the fact that government consumption is now is at its highest level since the early 90s as a percent of GDP, I think, in the national accounts. So do you think tax reform is really off the table if Labour comes in? Or if it's, say, a minority Labour government, do you think they're going to be under too much pressure to do something? What's your view around that?
As someone who's not a tax expert, I'll probably throw it back to you at some point. But I suppose like my initial thoughts is, politicians always craft their words carefully. My reading of those comments were, we're not going to do what we would call reform, which is like major changes to the system to try and improve efficiency. I think he probably left enough room open to give tax cuts at some point, maybe, but also worded it in a way that if he didn't, he could turn around and say, look, we promised no tax cuts. So we're just delivering on our promises. So the thing that, the fiscal drag question is really important. The thing that I'm also thinking about is in the last budget, you want to kind of, the idea or the kind of goal of a lot of fiscal policy macroeconomists is, at least in Australia, has been to balance the budget over the cycle. And so the idea there is like, in bad times, you might want to be expansionary. In good times, you want to be contractionary. And then on average, over the cycle, you're kind of neutral. And so the structural budget balance at the moment is in deficit and is in deficit and is predicted to be until 2034, 35. And the main thing that gets it back to balance is fiscal drag or bracket creep. So not giving back any income tax increases over the 10-year period. Which would be a brave government. And in addition to that, it also assumes no more new major, potential global crises like a Trump trade war or, things that pop up domestically like health crises or, improvements to our education system, things like that. So this discussion of, the level of taxation in the economy and the level of spending in the economy is really important if you're thinking about the fiscal sustainability or getting the budget to neutral over the cycle. Back to your original question. So the question is, do I think it's likely there will be no tax reform in the next parliament? I think the answer is it depends on the outcome. In a majority Labor, which no one really expects, I think they will stick to that commitment um, and not do anything really on tax. They might tweak income tax towards the end of the next term as a kind of election pitch for the next cycle. It's a bit more up in the air if there's a minority government. So we've obviously seen people like Allegra Spender advocating for some action on tax reform around income tax bracket indexation, and I think other Teal candidates probably feel similar. And then the other potential outcome is a minority Liberal government who've been a bit again mixed on their wording. I think that their current position is they will do something on tax if there's capacity to do so. So yeah, the summary there is not much, but depends on the Teals and the crossbench and what they want to get out of it. What's your sense from reading the news?
Well, I think the way you've described is the way that a more common person like myself sees what's being written out in public. I'm still new to Australia, so I take things very much at face value. Something I did find interesting is that the only person seriously describing tax policies and how they would change the system is a Teal, as you said, a Allegra Spender. The coalition's suggestions are all very around the margin, while Labor is just sort of not mentioning anything after getting so stung. Was it the 2019 election where they were stung talking about negative gearing and capital gains tax?
There is always this thing about you shouldn't fight the previous war. So I think they are fighting the previous war a bit there.
Yeah. And the thing is like, it's just about understanding what we think about those reforms. And so I think at some point we either need to do a pod or I'll need to write a post talking through the what was it called, the green paper or the Allegra Spender green paper, because as someone goes to the effort of actually suggesting policies, I quite like to think about them. Back in New Zealand, the Green Party used to do that all the time. I quite enjoyed going back and looking at what was in their policy proposals, and I'd be critical about a lot of it, but I much prefer to be in that world than a world where people aren't telling me anything. So I think it's hopefully a public service. Now, on this point of tax reform, you know, a lot of things get said in Australia, and I feel like there's this juxtaposition where people want to talk about equity and fairness and where people want to talk about productivity. And I think a lot of the reform conversation now is very focused on productivity rather than people paying the same sort of tax. And when we look at the situation with negative gearing and the capital gains tax being talked about, it's no longer saying should people with the same incomes be taxed the same. It's saying, are we getting the right investment decisions occurring in the economy due to the way the tax system is structured? Now, given that productivity focus, people are trying to find a dividend to pay for those tax cuts. If it was all fairness, we would have a situation where, as you say, there's growing concerns about fiscal sustainability, there's growing government consumption, and there's a growing tax take. And a lot of the spending initiatives, things like NDIS, mean that the government is larger now. And essentially, by saying we could make these tax reforms that will pay for themselves or increase productivity, it's a way of trying to say we can lift these boats and we can lead to a situation where we can afford things like NDIS. Now, I'm not sure tax reform is actually the thing on the agenda that will do that. Can you think of other things that might turn up in the budget, other types of reforms, such as industrial relations, that you think are likely to have a greater productivity dividend? Or do you think I'm just wrong and that tax is the productivity killer / future?
Yeah. So I like how you think there's a tax reform agenda being discussed as a premise of the question. I think one of the things I really liked about the Allegra Spender Green Paper is that she took the time and her team took the time to think through some things like you were saying and put out some ideas. We don't really see that a whole lot at the moment, particularly from other parties. I think on the tax question first, there is potentially efficiency gains from reforming the tax system. So you've got a whole heap of literature on that. And then in Australia context, the Henry Tax Review, Australia's Future Tax System, AFS. There's a great 4-hour pod with Ken Henry by Joe Walker that touches on that. That highly recommend for a long run, very long run. So I think there is potential there if you think about the reliance on income taxation and other small taxes we have around the states, and potentially switching them to something that's slightly more efficient in terms of a consumption tax or something like that. But I'm not a tax economist, so maybe we park that one, or you can have a rebuttal.
I might jump in just on that part. So the reason I was pushing us away from tax is I'm incredibly skeptical of people viewing the current productivity malaise in Australia as being a product of the tax system. If you're looking at a country like New Zealand where, you know, there's real, like, capital depth is low, then maybe you can argue something around taxation. And even then, it can be a stretch in terms of the amount it will improve productivity. Capital depth in Australia is very high.
Yeah,
Australia is a capital rich country. You know, I just like I know there's efficiency gains. I know it could improve some form of multi-factor productivity. I don't know if it's the big game in town for productivity.
no, but I think there is no big game in town, unfortunately. I think that's probably where we've struggled with productivity reform over the last 20 years is we keep wanting that silver bullet. And maybe that's the point you're making. People think tax reform's a silver bullet, like, you know, the Business Council of Australia and people like that coming out saying, if only we just did this one thing, we'd unleash productivity. I think that's very fair. But to the second part of your question, I don't think there is a silver bullet. It's a kind of like a combination of things. That's why the PC's last 5-year productivity inquiry, which I think was called Advancing Prosperity, and the previous one was Shifting the Dial. That, you know, there's a 1,000-page report with tens of recommendations. It's not just the one thing. So your question about what we might see in the budget, it's going to be unlikely we see anything productivity related. Kind of going back to your Trump question, the thing I probably didn't think about or mention is it may come up in the budget through the idea of insurance. Australia taking out insurance in the face of the uncertainty, which is one way you can frame it. And so I can see that happening. And that would, particularly under this government, look like them. They've already said they won't retaliate through tariffs, which is, I think, is a good thing, for all the reasons we can discuss later. But I think you might see it in more of this kind of local domestic industry subsidization, onshoring or nearshoring or whatever you call it. So I think that's something we'll see further in this budget, that kind of extension of the future made in Australia from the last budget. Wait and see what that looks like before we provide comment on, you know, the effectiveness on it. But I can see that occurring. And I think that will also be pitched as productivity enhancing by the government, if I'm putting my kind of like future hat on.
Cool. Well, I think I'll jump in there, because if the government is going to call that productivity enhancing, I just want to be on the record saying what a load of rubbish, right? That the thing is household incomes are the same as they were a decade ago. We've got a situation where labor productivity has been non-existent for a decade. And these types of reforms are about insurance. They can make sense in an uncertain world, but they come with a cost. I mean, that's why NDIS is seen as lowering productivity, because we're providing funds to people to insure them against these risks. And that's having some underlying cost, and we're willing to sacrifice some income as a society to support people in need. And that's perfectly legitimate. But pretending that will be productivity enhancing is just wild to me. So in this situation, we've had Australia truly underperform in productivity over the last decade. I think sometimes that's overstated, because Australia overperformed on productivity the decade before. Australia has seen a sharp increase in its terms and trade, which leads to a Balmoral cost disease type increase in income for exporters, which increases demands for non-tradable goods, which leads to, you know, more people being dragged into low productivity industries. Now we have a situation where unemployment is incredibly low in Australia, and yet household incomes are only the same as they were a decade ago. This is a very unique situation that we need to understand, and where the policies that you're saying that politicians will we'll call productivity enhancing will actually exacerbate this issue rather than improve it. And it might have a different rationale that makes sense, but it is not about productivity. Can you tell me definitively if there is a certain reason why Australia is struggling from this productivity paradox relative to the rest of the world? Or do we just not know?
Yeah, I think we've got some evidence, including some work that we've done at the E61 Institute and the Treasury's done, but I don't think we know fully what the driver is. So, like you say, Australia had very good productivity performance, which we're comparing to historically. That's true. And the other point that people will often make is there's been a global productivity slowdown around the advanced economies around the world. So, Australia's not unique in that, and there's a range of theories put forward around why that's the case globally. But I think the research that we have in Australia so far shows that even though the rest of the world has been declining their productivity growth, we are actually falling further behind the frontier in important industries. So, like, do we have a definitive answer? No. Do we need to do more research on it? Yes. But there's like some things I suppose you can start to look at that kind of triangulates maybe what's going on, trying to understand some of the drivers. And so some of the work we've done at E61 and again, Treasury's also done a little bit of work on shows, declining job mobility occurring across the economy. So people switching jobs less. You see decreasing rates of business entry, which suggests maybe there's less incentive for new firms or to compete with existing firms or to bring new products to market, or there's some impediment there. You also see declining ability of what was called like reallocation. So of getting the right workers to the right firms or getting workers to growing firms, that kind of reallocation has declined over time in Australia. And there's some other work that kind of shows, touching on your point before around the insurance we're taking out, that there's a large reallocation of workers into these care sectors, which on average tend to be lower measured productivity. So it's kind of like just a mathematical point that we have lower productivity because we've got more people going and working in those sectors, and those sectors also grow slower as well. And so some of those issues you might be more concerned about or care about more, whereas some you might not. So for example, on the care sector one, you might be very happy with that declining productivity due to reallocation into a lower productivity sector because we're making a social choice about that being something that we value. So yeah, no definitive answer. One just before I finish up, one thing on the previous thing we were discussing around, putting my foresight hat on about the budget is there was a review released, I think yesterday, kind of in the, probably got missed in the wash of a range of different things, which was a review of our intelligence agencies. And one of the things that I was kind of interested in that got called out was the call within that for a new effectively body or unit to be set up within Treasury. And this is an intelligence agency review, not an economic review, calling for a unit to be set up in Treasury to really focus on what they call economic security and bring that to the forefront of intelligence thinking, which to me is a bit of a red flag or a red light, a bit of a concern of we might see some stuff in the budget around that. Because often the idea of economic resilience or economic security is used as a reason or explanation or defense for some of this domestic industry subsidization. And we often see that domestic industry subsidization to be in things that political parties just tend to care about for votes. We very rarely see the subsidies we often see the subsidies in areas like domestic manufacturing, where they think there's more votes rather than other areas.
No, that's a really important point to share. And so I do want to touch on that latter point, but I wanted to note something on the job mobility point as well. I love the E61 job mobility research. I love the discussion about job mobility. I love all the discussion about how important it is to have reallocation. I remember when Dan worked with us as well and how much important work he did there and how much thinking he'll do, which was quite inspiring to listen to. But one thing constantly plays in the back of my head, and that's New Zealand. You probably noticed because I mention it all the time. But in New Zealand, job mobility rates are high relative to the rest of the world. There's a culture of you're at a job for more than 2 years. Is there something wrong with you? I mean, I was at my first job for 7 years, and I remember my brother making fun of me for it. But I just loved my work colleagues. It was a great place to work. So when it comes to that type of culture, you'd be thinking, man, New Zealand must be like futuristic, technological frontier. Labor
Yeah.
productivity is 30% below Australia's. Average earnings are 30% lower than Australia, even with all that mobility. And so the thing I would pose is that you need to understand why mobility is telling you something about productivity. And you can actually have a reverse causation thing going on. So what happens if the slowdown in job mobility we're observing is not because there are these growing barriers that are stopping people from moving, but because technological progress has slowed, and so there's less incentive for people to move. People are still making the right choices. There are no barriers, but it's just technological progress slowed. We need to differentiate those two to really talk about policy. Are there any
Yeah.
insights about that you could share with me?
No, I think that's right. So, maybe part of the 30% problem is you're over here and not over there, and all the good Kiwis are on the Gold Coast.
I think it's improved since I moved, but
Yeah. But no, like your point is a right one. It's a fair one. So we don't fully understand even, there is no right number for job mobility, right? That's the counterpoint. And so we're using that kind of decline as a bit of a diagnosis tool, but not saying it's definitive. The important thing to understand is what is driving that? What is the underlying driver? Is there some barrier? Is there something that's changed? Um, and so we do have a little bit of work on that, but nothing again definitive. Like further work here is useful. So some work that E61's done has looked at non-compete clauses and their rising prevalence of those, and they have increased, particularly across industries where you would think they'd be less prevalent, such as service-based industries in terms of childcare, hairdressers, things like that. And so it's potentially the rising prevalence of those could be restricting one of the things restricting job mobility. I don't think we'd say they're the only thing, but the way we need further research to understand what barriers there potentially are. So, for example, there's been a range of labour market regulation put in place over the last 3 years, which obviously has occurred after the slowdown we're talking about, but that's something that's worth keeping in mind. And so, understanding whether they're adding to further frictions or barriers in the job mobility area. But taking a step back when it comes to like what is the silver bullet, what do we want to do? It's very hard to be definitive in the productivity literature about which way the causation is running. We should strive for that, obviously, but often we don't have that. And so when it comes to policymakers, we don't always have the benefit or the time to like wait for the perfect evidence that says this is 100% the thing that's causing Y, therefore pull this lever. And so the way I like to think about it is we can use our economic frameworks, add the sort of data descriptive diagnosis work, and then we should be trying to do whatever we can to kind of tilt the balance towards the probability of it being productivity enhancing rather than detracting. And so like the non-compete clauses are probably a good example here. We've got some data on them now. We still don't have perfect causation. Like we don't have a perfect quasi experiment on the way the causation goes, but it looks like they're associated with declining job mobility and poorer wage outcomes. And so we're not 100% certain about that, but we can, change policy to remove those, and hopefully it tilts the, labor market towards being more allocative, more mobile. And we don't have to see people being more mobile. It could be just they then have a more credible outside threat of what they could do in the labor market. So that's kind of like my philosophy when thinking about these things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And the for listeners, the context I'd give for this is it might feel like we've made a tangent, but it's possible there'll be announcements about non-competes, about industrial relations, about other things that will act as barriers, but at the same time are there to maybe solve some sort of failure. So with non-competes, the idea is people might invest in workers more if they know that worker can't just go to a competitor. With industrial relations, there's a bargaining process that might lead to unfair wages or conditions on people that you're trying to address. And it's the trade-offs associated with those. So if those were to come up, I think Lachlan's description is very useful there. The other thing I'll note with a lot of that sort of stuff is we have to be a little bit careful just looking at productivity. Look at work from home. Imagine if working from home actually is found to lower productivity. But it lowers productivity by less than a situation by less than the amount wages go down. So what happens here is people are willing to work from home because they would rather work from home. Firms are willing to offer them the chance to work from home, knowing they won't be quite as productive, but because there's a compensation for them in terms of how the wage differential changes. In that situation, workers and firms are loving it. It's good for them. Productivity falls. If we were to chase around productivity complaining that there's a failure, we're missing the point that actually there's something we haven't measured that they value.
Yeah.
And when we think about these types of mismeasured values and chasing different things, do you think that our discussion of a lot of policies can miss that? The one I'm going to bring us to now, because I'm expecting a lot of talk about it, is the NDIS. Do you feel that there's overemphasis on the cost pressure, or do you think this is something we have to be mindful of, that we should be measuring more, or a scheme that should just be slashed?
Yeah, so I think there's two components to that question. So on the productivity side, that's you've provided a great example. So this kind of goes to a philosophical discussion about economic measurement, right? So why do we measure GDP? GDP, we actually don't care about GDP per se. We care about people's welfare. And it just so happens that GDP correlates really strongly with people's welfare and opportunity. And similar for productivity, we care about productivity not for productivity itself. We care about productivity for what it means for people's welfare, their incomes, their opportunities. And so on the work from home example, yeah, we're very happy with that outcome, even though it's productivity flat or detracting. I suppose this is why we take longer term views on things like GDP and productivity, because there can be these level shifts along the way, whether it's up or down in the way we measure them. But over time, the idea is focusing on the growth gives you a pretty good projection or something to correlate with welfare and people's outcomes. But yeah, there could be a structural change in the economy. So for example, your NDIS example, if we assume we can measure the care sector perfectly well, even when we do that, it's a lower growing sector just because of like some restrictions on it. You're kind of shifting the growth curve structurally over time. And so it looks like we're becoming less productive, but maybe our welfare or happiness, or not happiness, but overall welfare as a society has improved. So I think the focus on productivity can miss that, but I don't think, given the lack of action that looks to improve productivity over, say, the last 10 years, I don't think it's fair to say we're overly focused on productivity. It might get a lot of mentions in the media, but when it comes to policy making, it actually gets relatively less attention. So I think we're still probably comfortably in the safe zone when it comes to discussing productivity. But I think the current government's been, pretty strong and clear in pointing out that it's not the only thing. So the reason why we have the NDIS isn't just for economic growth reasons. We have it for social reasons. The second part of your question is more about how big should the NDIS be? How quickly should it be growing? Which is related to productivity, but not just productivity. That's a harder question. It involves like social preferences about people's redistribution and things like that. As economists, we're thinking about what are we trying to achieve as a government? We're trying to support people who have really severe disabilities or this shock to them in their life that's not possible to insure. Thus the I in the NDIS. And so, there's a question about whether the scheme is actually doing that at the moment or if it's going beyond that. And if it goes beyond that, whether that additional stuff, which are these kind of less severe disabilities, whether it's well placed to be dealing with those. So that's a question for policymakers. If you take a step back and put the kind of like bigger picture fiscal hat on, there is a question around the sustainability of the scheme in terms of its total cost growth. So it's growing at about 10% per year at the moment. It's 49 billion a year, growing at 10% a year. They're hoping to get it down to 8% per year. But even if they get it to 8% per year and you kind of project that forward, we're growing at a much lower level than that. So the kind of share of GDP is ever increasing. And it's not really realistic politically to think we can keep paying, or people will be happy to keep paying for that constantly increasing share of GDP. And so it naturally leads to the question of what do you do about the total cost of the scheme and how do you curtail that? So as an economist thinking about fiscal sustainability, that's one of the most important questions, and I think we've kind of avoided it so far. We've had a Royal Commission on Disability, we've had an NDIS review on disability, and what we've ended up with is some creative accounting about getting to 8%. I don't think we'll see anything further on that in this budget, but I think whoever wins the election and comes out the other side, it's going to be one of the big questions for them. It's easy to say, we've seen a few people do it in the media. It's very easy to say, this is a costly scheme that's growing fast, let's cut it. That's a very easy comment. I think the rubber hits the road when it's like, well, what part of it do you try and contain or cut? And so you got to go back to the underlying reasons for the scheme or the policy, what you're trying to achieve and whether it's achieving that. And for me, my reading of the original scheme is it's there to support people with severe disabilities with their social and economic engagement. It sounds like there's a decent part of the scheme that's more targeted at less severe disabilities. So there's an open question about whether it should be supporting them as much. And then there's questions about, I suppose, how the scheme's funded between the federal government and the states and territories, and whether that creates incentive issues for the states and territories to withdraw from certain markets, like the ones that are helping people with less severe disabilities, because the cost then gets transitioned or shifted to the federal government. And so trying to address some of those incentive issues to stop the cost growth is important as well.
Yeah, no, I like the way you've framed that. The NDIS is probably an area where I can talk a bit more because I'm a social policy nerd. So what's the rationale behind our entire social support system? We want to provide people a certain minimum standard, and that minimum standard can vary based on what happens to you. If you have a very severe disability, then to be given the same set of opportunities insofar as, ways of generating utility, ways of generating happiness, you probably need to be provided more resources. So the distinction between the disability support payment and the job seeker payment in terms of payment rate and in terms of supplements was on that basis. And NDIA feels like it was an extension in terms of saying there are people with very severe needs and they deserve some type of payment to put them on that same standard. So immediately the key thing we can ask is, are we paying more than that for people? And that's one thing you outlined there. And that's beyond my understanding or ability to be able to tell. But when someone says, let's cut the scheme by 50%, we better well need to have asked this question and figure out where that is. I think the thing that's concerning me is people keep pointing at autism, accounting for autism amongst people under the age of 18, accounting for 69% of claimants. And then they say, let's cut the scheme 50% in terms of cost. But that 69% of claimants is something like 14% of the cost of the scheme, mate. So it's a little bit of a false equivalence. A big chunk of the cost of your scheme, as our colleague Theo Gibbons pointed out to us, was supported payments for people who are living at home and suffering from a severe disability and receiving support there. Now, what's the nature of that support? What's the alternative? What's the underlying cost with that? Bringing people in for care is very expensive. I've talked to those types of workers before, and they receive a lot of money because it's very difficult work. They have to work very difficult and long hours. But it is very expensive compared to an economies of scale type solution where a lot of people who are suffering from conditions end up moving in together. With the aging population, that part of the scheme is where the blowout's going to be. Stop pointing to your autistic 6-year-olds that you think are being misdiagnosed and saying that's where your big savings are going to be, because they're not. That's a headline. That's a headline that will get you in the AFR because you can talk big numbers of people, but it's not big numbers of cost. And if you turn around and say you're going to cut the cost 50%, it's going to be cutting it to these people with severe conditions. So we better have put thought into it about what the alternative is. My fear isn't so much the reduction in spending, because as you say, it's unsustainable as it is now. It's about not putting in the thought to make sure we minimize harm when we do it.
Yeah. And there is the Royal Commission, the NDIS review. Hopefully through those two things and ongoing policy development, there is a lot of thought going into it. I just suspect a lot of media commentators, like you're pointing out, go from the top down, not the bottom up.
Hello everyone. everyone, it is Matt here, just to give a little update of what's coming next. So we've had the main podcast, and then Lachlan and I had an ad hoc discussion of potential policies and how we'd think about them. Now, we hadn't prepared and we were just talking off the top of our head, so it's much more of just a random yarn. So feel free to stop here for the organised part, but if you're interested in hearing what policies we came up with and what we saw as our priorities, then keep listening. See you all later. Yeah.
Onto maybe as a segue from that to a question for you. So I was doing some quick numbers before this chat, and I haven't got them QA'd, so maybe you can QA them live for me. But in terms of fiscal sustainability, so over all the budgets so far this government has had, there's been net upgrades, so even including for increases in payments, of 251 billion. And then of all the decisions they've taken on the saving and expenditure side, there's net expenditure of 60 billion. So there's 251 billion of probably one-off improvements to the budget, and they've spent 60 billion of that in mostly ongoing stuff. So that's 24%. So it's locked in a lot of ongoing spends. But obviously, budgets are about priorities of the government. They clearly have had priorities. And I think people who kind of give them a whack and say they're not a very Labor social reforming government are maybe missing the forest for the trees, because you go back through, you see job seeker increases, you see 2 Commonwealth rent assistance increases, you see reforms to the paid parenting payment single, changes to childcare, funding for aged care workers. So there's a lot in there. And, I think it's clear when you look at the numbers, they've spent a lot to achieve those goals. So with that as the fiscal backdrop, what are the 3 things you're doing as the treasurer on Tuesday night when you get up and give your budget speech?
The 3 things I'm doing as treasurer. Oh man, you put me on the spot.
Or maybe one. Start with one, and then I'll see if I can think of one when you inevitably ask me.
Oh yeah, you've put me on the spot though, as a non-Australian. That's what I'm going to say, and the fact that I should have known this question was coming and didn't prepare, but I'll give it a go nonetheless. So my focus as treasurer coming in would be to say we need to take what's going on overseas seriously. There's a lot of things we talk about domestically and a lot of issues that we argue about as political parties. But in this situation, with the growing uncertainty overseas and a substantial change in the world order, we need to form a bipartisan agreement about how we're going to work with defense spending going forward, and make a clear commitment to a certain increase in defense spending, and structure how that will be sustainable in the budget to make sure it's a clear and credible commitment going forward. I know we talk about all these economics issues. I'm way more interested in them. But I think just in this world, this sort of thing's swamping everything else we're thinking about, because it affects how we're going to have tariffs applied to us by the US. It affects our relationship with other communities around us. It affects how we're going to negotiate with our partners in India and New Zealand and the United Kingdom as well. So I'd probably make that the main priority and be focused more on that level than anything else.
Yeah. And so I think I can't remember the exact number, but I think our defense spending is currently just above 2% of GDP. It might be like 2.03 or something. And the current government's trying to get it to 2.33% of GDP. And the last thing I saw was the opposition were thinking about committing to 2.5% of GDP, these are all big numbers. But historically, the issue has been actually getting the money out the door. We've really struggled to hit our commitments on the defense side previously. Do you think that's a potential issue if you're going to increase defense spending as part of your plan? And how do we think about that if we've already got declining productivity growth? I assume part of that expenditure we're making stuff in Australia, or are we buying it from overseas? How do I think about the allocation of the workforce?
That's a good question. My hope is in the background that the major parties have been talking to each other about what our underlying strategy is as a country. So my impression is that, Australia very much still views AUKUS, is that the right way to say it?
There's a couple of different things. We've got AUKUS, which we
AUKUS, yeah.
excluded you guys from that. But we do
Uh,
have, is it, yeah, how do you pronounce it? We've got ANZUCs, which is us, you,
yeah.
and the US, which I'm sure you guys will send your 2 airplanes or whatever it is to come help us.
They're transport aircraft.
Yeah,
We don't
good.
have fighter jets anymore. Um, so I think the thing is like it'll be defining it in terms of understanding how we see our alliances. So when you think about, okay, I am not a defense person, so this is all going to
Mm,
sound super naive. It's more that as a person, what would I think is the big budget focus?
yeah,
And it's quite disappointing to me that hearing myself say it's going to be the type and amount of defense spending rather than all these other programs I care a lot about. But
yeah,
just because it feels like the dominant issue. So it would be how does it fit within that strategy? And so at the moment, there's the submarine purchases. Um, you know, with all the talk about the US not being a reliable partner, how does that work and how do we commit our spending? I don't know how much you can commit right now, rather than saying that there'll be a pathway of spending and we need to evaluate what our defensive strategy should be as a country, given our position and given unique uncertainty around our alliances right now. I think it would be a bit trite to commit to one thing or the other, because you'd either be committing to the US as an uncertain partner, or you'd be committing away from the US when Australia's interests are still very aligned with US interests.
mm,
So I think it would be more just setting up a credible path and an initial investigative work about how we should think about the Australian defensive strategy, and then working from there.
yeah. No, that makes sense. And then in terms of getting the sustainability of that, are you thinking there's some tax options on the revenue side, or
So I'm the treasurer, right? So
you're in
I
charge
get
of
to decide.
taxation? Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, people are probably expecting like a removal of the capital gains discount or something around negative gearing. I don't agree with the negative gearing stuff. I do agree on the side of changing the capital gains discount, but in terms of removing it. But I would probably say there's a whole lot of random stuff like movie subsidies. Collect all of those and cancel them.
Yeah.
I don't want to be subsidizing random industries anymore because some consultant's economic impact statement said that it's making me $10 for every dollar I put in, because it's a lie. I happen to have done enough of been involved with enough of that sort of work to know that's a whole lot of trash, and I would just cancel all those programs. And people would complain a lot, and good for them. There might even be complaints from the Gold Coast about it affecting what's that movie world?
I was going to
Um,
say, I reckon
yeah.
most of the value of those subsidies are capitalized into Byron Bay property prices, which is where a lot of the movie stars buy up.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not just the movie subsidies I'll be looking to cancel. There's a whole series of things. And, for things where they're saying that there's a national security interest, I'll just want the case to be made a bit more clearly. So the payment for the quantum computers,
Yeah.
um, you know, it's it seems pretty fishy to me. If I went back to New Zealand, the subsidies for movies, definitely, because I don't know why we're giving Peter Jackson money to just buy Wellington property. But secondly, the payments for making train locomotive carriages in Dunedin, like it's just pointless stuff that costs a lot of money, that's spending a lot of money per job. So I'll be looking at removing a bunch of that. Would it cover the defense spending? No. At that stage, I'll need to ask myself, well, what is the tax instrument? Is it turning around and removing the capital gains discount, or is it increasing the GST rate?
Mm.
Or is it introducing a national defense levy
Mm.
that's put on top of people's payroll, which I'm sure will go down a treat? You could even make it like the high earner levy. High earners are the people that benefit the most from making sure we've got economic security.
Yeah.
Ergo, we're going to levy them. Who knows?
Yeah. No, like we don't mind a levy in Australia. They're definitely not taxes, as we learned under Tony Abbott. They're different. We don't mind. So we've got the Medicare levy, which I'm sure you're aware of, which is not a tax, just happens to apply to your income on 1 to 1.5%. Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Um, so
Right.
in
So
terms,
do I need
sorry,
a third as well?
I like things in yeah,
Threes.
in prime numbers ideally. So 3, 5, 7, 9. I'll accept
Yeah.
10.
I'll probably stop at three. So I'm not going to mention the digital services tax, which I did on the blog, because I don't particularly want that. Um, the Although I do see there's a lot of pushback about the the media payments that are being charged to Facebook and Google. So it is definitely a hot topic area that's worth discussing. For a third policy, I've got to pick something that's a bit more normal and non-contentious. So I would just have um, one of I've got to raise revenue, but both of the things I'm talking about have revenue costs. So it would be either indexing benefits against average wages, or it would be indexing tax brackets against CPI or average wages, depending on what we're trying to achieve.
Mm.
So in both those cases, those cost money. I'm not sure I can get away with that, but I'd be severely tempted to do one of those. Given
Mm.
I'm a Labour government, probably the former.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've kind of stolen a couple of mine there, which is nice and put me out of the pump. But yeah, riffing off your, which I think is a very, very important point and pertinent around the kind of geostrategic environment. A policy that I've always thought was pretty stupid and had an unclear rationale, which is going to get a lot more limelight now with Elon Musk and the tech bros supporting Trump, is the media bargaining code, which then morphed into the media bargaining incentive. And so, for those who haven't heard much about this, the idea is, I still struggle to follow the logic a little bit. But the idea is, media companies like news companies used to make most of their revenue from advertising. Google and other tech platforms came in, not doing news, but doing other things, and stole all that advertising revenue. And to help those news companies stay, solvent, platforms should send them money for, notionally the fact that they include news links on their on their pages or on the Twitter feed or on Facebook, even though you still have to like pay if you want to read the article if it's paywalled. And it still drives traffic to those news websites because when people click on the link, they go to the website. And so the idea here is it was actually a coalition government in Australia, a conservative government, who forced these news companies into, I suppose, like a negotiation with the tech companies, and if they didn't get a deal, there was like there was an incentive to get a deal; they'd be punished otherwise. So that's the original policy, which was already a bit dubious. And then since then, the government decided, because Facebook and others said, we're not really sure why we're paying these people for things that we're not using. So they're not going to renew those deals. The government now is going to start taxing these big tech companies if they don't enter into the deals. And so I firstly think the policy has no real rationale. Maybe it makes sense as a quasi digital services tax. You'll know more about that than me. But in a world where our geostrategic ally is kind of semi dictated by tech bro views, it just seems like a silly policy to have. And so I'd be getting rid of that. Is it a quasi digital services tax?
It is actually fairly different. So
Okay.
the New Zealand Commerce Commission was looking at the same type of policy when the tax authority in New Zealand was looking at a digital services tax. So the two of us would often meet up to discuss them. Um, it's fairly different in terms of uh, it's attributing that advertising revenue directly to a specific organization rather than it just being a generic tax. And I think the operationalizations of it different as well, because it was like the quantity of news links that are on those social media platforms was driving the revenue. So it's sort of like they were paying a fee for service of just showing that link. When a DST is just saying some portion of your revenue as a company
Yeah.
based on your user base in that country should be allocated to that country, and we're going to do that by just taxing the attributed revenue in that jurisdiction at some levy rate. So the two are quite different. I think the rationale for a DST is closer to what you would have for a tariff, when this other thing is trying to make a form of user pay. And weirdly, the tariff argument's actually probably the better argument.
Yeah.
Which is not something I'd normally think I'd say, but
Yeah.
Well, what's number two?
Number two, again, is tax, and you've kind of taken it. So the classic was increased GST. It's a more efficient tax. You can decrease taxes elsewhere, or you can just increase GST to pay for our preferences to be a higher expenditure society. But I think you might have mentioned that on the way through, so I'll put a line through that.
No,
The
it
other one
definitely wasn't one of mine, so I think you can have it. Yeah.
Okay, because I need something that raises revenue or decreases expenses. So, but related to that, so increasing GST, but also there's a kind of well covered by a couple of public commentators, economists around the WA GST deal, which is actually time limited, but just keeps getting extended. So just putting an end to that deal, which the cost of that is increasing with time, given the state of WA's budget is constantly improving. So raising the GST rate at the same time as removing that GST deal would be a fairly decent saving to the budget position. The other one that I was thinking on, the final one on the revenue side that you mentioned was the income tax brackets. So indexing them, I've kind of been on the fence about that. There's pros and cons. The risk is if you index them, it makes the budget position worse unless you do something else that offsets it. But I think by indexing them, it creates a bit of a sharper incentive for policymakers and politicians to do stuff elsewhere rather than just sitting back and relying on increasing income bracket creep to pay for things. It makes the trade-off a bit more front and center.
Yeah, definitely. And it creates greater certainty for investment and the such.
Yeah.
And the main argument I've heard against the brackets, to my mind, is, it provides an automatic stabilizer to demand shocks. But,
we
have a lot of those in the tax and benefit system already. And we have a central bank.
Yeah, we've got all-seeing central banks, so I'm very comfortable. Very comfortable with them managing the demand shock.
Exactly.
So yeah, they're kind of my three pitches on the tax side. The expenditure side's a bit harder.
You're giving 6. I love it. You see, this is why Lachlan's the expert.
What are we up to? I've lost count. There's a range of things that we don't have enough time to cover today that I would cut, that you've kind of put into your bucket of random tidbits. For example, the green hydrogen production tax incentives, I'd probably cut those. But that's getting down into the weeds. It's obviously harder on the expenditure side. We've discussed the NDIS total cost, so I probably can't go back there. To me, and maybe you can apply this to the NDIS as well. There's been a little bit of movement in aged care on I suppose, like co-payments or contributions. So a lot of Australia's transfer system or welfare state is based around the idea of, it being relatively well targeted at those who need the help the most. And I think there's a lot of social buy-in, or there's a social compact on that. And there's a couple of programs like the NDIS, like aged care, where we kind of go away from that and provide universal coverage. And so I think on the expenditure side, if I'm trying to reel in or decrease some expenditures, I'm looking at aged care, where we've already taken some small steps on user co-pays or contributions, and introducing things like that for households with income or wealth over a certain amount that have the ability to pay for themselves. And similarly on the NDIS, particularly if we're thinking about I know it's not like you said in the numbers before, not a huge amount of the scheme, but in areas that aren't the severe or very severe disability, whether we can introduce income or wealth uh, tests that better target the programs at those who need the assistance the most. That's where I'd be looking on the expenditure side.
Yeah, even though I was saying that the expenditure pressures were in certain places, if there's a view that it's fairer to cut in a certain area, it's all should be on the table. I mean, we just need to make sure there's consistent prioritization and like thought being applied.
Yeah, and
Um,
similarly, like if I extend that kind of like worldview of mine further, the idea of targeting and the value
mm,
of targeting, and I think it's important to say if we had all the money in the world, I'd want to provide all the help in the world, but we don't have all the money in the world, so we have to make hard decisions about priorities and trade-offs. I'd probably restructure the childcare subsidy to be more beneficial to lower and middle income earners uh, and less subsidy to households on $530,000 as it is
mm.
currently. That's easy to say. I haven't done the hard work on what effective marginal tax rates look like when I do that, because then it kind of implies a harder taper rate. So it's easy to say as a holistic thing. I'd have to go away and do the hard work on what the EMTRs look like.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like we can't have a Scandinavian welfare state with US Australian style taxation. That's just a matter of fact. And if people aren't willing to increase average tax rates by 30 percentage points, then we're going to have a situation where we have to accept sharp EMTRs, where we have to accept more means testing and targeting efficiency of our programs. I mean, that's the Australia New Zealand model, and that's why we're able to help people that are in need while keeping the fiscal costs down. Unlike the US, where they decide they'll keep the fiscal costs down by just not helping people in need, right? Unlike Scandinavia, where they're like, we will just not keep the fiscal costs down and we'll have universal payments. Those are the choices, right? Um, let's own them.
Mm. The other one, which this, sorry, I don't know what number I'm up to. This is a less thought through
I,
one.
I think eight.
Yeah. Um, so as an economist, I think the approach the government's taken to HEX debt has been very poor and not thought through. Um, Giving people cuts to their HEX debts or the university and TAFE debts to a lot of people who are going to pay them off anyway, and we're getting a loan that's pretty much a real interest rate of zero. So I think that policy is poor, but I think there is an open question about the cost of higher education and whether we've got that quite right and if the subsidies right. Um, so what my recommendation there is, I'm not sure. I think we want to go and look at the course costs and think about how we're providing the subsidy and what courses we're providing it for. Maybe there's an improvement we could make there.
Yeah, I've forgotten about the wiping off of student debt. Has that happened yet, or is it?
So yeah, good question. It's kind of like a two-step thing. So they've already changed the indexation, which was CPI, to the lower of wage price index, WPI and CPI, and they applied it retrospectively. So it effectively wiped a proportion of debt off. I think it was about $2 billion worth to the government's balance sheet, a bit over that, just over that. And then their next step is to wipe 20% of all existing debt, um, and then change the repayment uh, threshold and approaches, which the repayment threshold and rates changes are, I think, are pretty good ones. They go from average repayment rates to marginal repayment rates, but
Hmm.
it's the 20% wiping of existing student debt that doesn't make a lot of sense and hasn't really provided a clear policy rationale. And so that is a commitment of theirs that's going to, it's in the budget, but they haven't introduced legislation for it. It's a post-election thing they'll do if re-elected.
Oh, it's one of those bloomin' bribes for students. Vote for us instead of the Greens. No, no, if I was that's just after the defense thing, I would scrap that. I mean, what a handout to people who already have invested in their human capital and have the ability to earn income. Um, it's shocking. That's just a regressive transfer. I have no
Yeah.
tolerance for those sorts of things. And like those are sorts of things that should definitely be called out And how can you be a left-wing party giving these sorts of regressive transfers to high-income earners and feeling like you're really capturing the essence of what is happening with needing insurance in society? Nonetheless, I digress.
No, it's quite interesting. And so for those who are not, aware of how the system works, you actually don't have to repay the debt until you earn above certain incomes. And so that's the insurance aspect to it, I suppose, in that if things don't go well for you and don't come off, you actually never have to repay it. And so it's one of those policy areas that, to quote something that Chris Richardson said on Twitter the other day, really gets my goat, in that there's lots of examples used in the media of one-off examples of people with large debts and how it affects them. But there's no real analysis or evidence brought to bear on the debate about how many people are affected in that way, and what's led to them being in that situation. And so I think what happens is people read about individuals with debts of $80,000 and think that's outrageous, and it could be, and then they make decisions around the whole system that actually don't make sense that follows from that.
Indeed. Indeed. So I see that we managed to make our 10-minute chat take an hour and 10 minutes. And there's a lot of stuff there. This might end up being quite a long podcast as a result. And I think, no doubt a listener will appreciate the fact that we talked about so many different budget items and really added huge amounts. Well, I said I mean, you have added huge amounts of value here. I just got overexcited about everything. So I think we should wrap it up there, though. So thanks for coming along again, Lachlan.
Thanks for having me, Matt, and sorry for running over time. I've got a long list of other things I thought would be interesting, but we'll save that for the post-budget wrap-up.
Exactly. Cool. Thank you. Farewell, everyone.
Thanks.